6 months on with no end in sight. What's next for Gaza? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. Six months ago, Hamas crossed the border into Israel, leaving 1,200 people dead and taking more than 250 people hostage. The Gaza Health Ministry says more than 33,000 people have been killed by Israel, and there's an ongoing humanitarian crisis. Meanwhile, Israel has become increasingly isolated internationally, with even its closest ally, the United States, demanding that it do more to help protect Palestinian civilians in Gaza. Sam Mednick has more in this report.
On Sunday, Israel said that it had completed its operation into the southern city of Khan Yunis and that it was withdrawing its troops. This marks a key end to one of the phases of this ground offensive. Israel has been there for several months. Now, they said they were going to keep a significant number of troops inside of Gaza and that they were going to switch to intelligence-based raids. This would also give these troops time to recuperate. Now, this comes as Sunday marks 6 months since this war began, and there appears to be no end in sight. Conflict analysts have called it one of the deadliest and most destructive wars in recent history. On the Gaza side, there have been more than 33,000 people who have been killed. The United Nations says that half the population, about 1 million people, are facing imminent famine. I spoke to one woman named Lama. Her family was displaced from the north to the south of Gaza. She said that after 6 months of war, they are tired of the pain and the hunger. And even if the war ends and they go back to the north, they have nowhere to live. Their house was destroyed. On Israel's side, about 1,200 people were killed, mostly on October 7th when Hamas attacked Israel. Israel's military said they've lost 600 soldiers, 4 of which were killed on Saturday. Now, while the attacks are continuing in Gaza, there are ceasefire talks that have restarted in Cairo. This director of the CIA, intelligence chiefs from Israel, as well as Hamas delegates are meant to be there. But it's unclear if these talks are going to yield anything. Months of on and off discussions have resulted in very little. But there's mounting international pressure right now to come up with a deal from the United States, as well as within the country. Israelis rallied, tens of thousands of them, across the nation on Saturday and Sunday, calling for Netanyahu to resign, but also calling for them to come to a deal to get the hostages home. I spoke to one man, his nephew is being held hostage. He said that they have told the war cabinet that they need to instruct the negotiating team to come up with an agreement now. He said that time is running out. Sam Mednick with the Associated Press for CGTN in Jerusalem.
Joining us now is Jonathan Fowler. He's the Senior Communications Manager for the UN's Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees. Jonathan, great to have you with us. If we look at those numbers again. You're welcome, sir. If we look at those numbers, 33,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, including 13,000 children, according to the latest figures. 1.7 million Palestinians have been displaced. The Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF, Ted Shaban, recently talked about the situation in the enclave. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Children cannot access age-appropriate nutritious food or medical services and have less than 2 to 3 liters of water per day. The consequences have been clear. In March, we reported that 1 in 3 children under 2 years of age in the northern part of the Gaza Strip suffer from acute malnutrition, a figure that has more than doubled in the last 2 months. Dozens of children in the northern Gaza Strip have reportedly died from malnutrition and dehydration in recent weeks, and half the population is facing catastrophic food insecurity.
So, Jonathan, major donors like the United States and Canada have cut funding to UNRWA, and Israel has blocked the entry of some aid trucks into the region. What is your assessment of the situation there?
Well, yeah, thank you very much indeed for the question. I should stress to begin with, in fact, Canada is among the donors that has returned to the fold. We've had a number of our donors have returned over recent months and weeks, and that's a very important sign of the imperative that they feel to keep our aid operation going. I mean, the current situation, of course, is extremely problematic. As the previous report stressed, we've had 33,000 people killed, but The estimated injury toll is also extremely significant, close to 76,000 people. So all told, if you combine dead and injured, you're talking about 5% of the population of Gaza. And I would invite anybody to extrapolate that figure, lay it onto their own country or their own city or community, and imagine what that actually means. And indeed, the death and injury toll for children is absolutely shocking. But currently, what we're unable to do, notably, is in the north of Gaza, is we have not been we've not received permission to access the north of Gaza repeatedly, and then finally, on around the 25th of March. Israeli authorities informed the United Nations that we, UNRWA, the largest humanitarian organization operating in the Gaza Strip, could no longer supply aid to any kind of the north, to the north.
Now, Jonathan, has that changed in any way with this latest announcement by the Israelis that they will be opening another crossing point? That hasn't happened yet. There have been delays, but will that change how you will get food and other aid into the north of Gaza?
Well, we would certainly hope so. I mean, from the beginning of this war, we have been advocating for more crossings and a better flow of aid across all crossing points. Now, Eretz is particularly important because it's quite close to the port of Ashdod, which means no need to build an artificial port or other such projects, but actually aid can be shipped into Ashdod and brought into Eretz. But it's not open yet. And so really the proof is going to be in what the quantity of aid is going to be that can flow through that crossing. And also, you know, the level of inspections, these kind of things. As it stands, we need to get a bare minimum of 500 trucks a day of supplies, mostly food, but also medication, shelter supplies like tarpaulins, blankets, into the Gaza Strip, and when we're not even scratching the surface of that, we're getting around 169, 170 trucks on average a day so far this month, and that is not equal to the 500 that's needed for the bare minimum survival.
And Jonathan, as you are aware, there's a great deal of political and legal controversy over what is happening in Gaza right now, especially with the supply of humanitarian aid. In fact, the UN's most senior human rights official, Volker Turk, said in an interview with the British state broadcaster, the BBC, that Israel bore significant blame for the humanitarian crisis, and there is plausible case that Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war, although we do know that legally any prosecution would have to show some kind of intent to starve people. What are you seeing?
Well, what we're seeing on the ground is one of the sharpest onset famine situations in many, many years. And also the number of people who are facing catastrophic food insecurity, which is the tipping point for famine, is around 1 million, more than 1 million. So that's like half the population of the Gaza Strip. Now, this is entirely a result of the inability to get food into the Gaza Strip, to get it around the Gaza Strip to people who need to eat. You know, we're talking about in the north, estimates that people are surviving on 12% of their daily calorific needs. This is an area where there's 300,000 people trapped, largely cut off from aid. So while I'm not going to comment on the specific claims by, or the specific accusations by people who are better placed to look at those kind of issues, what we do see is that international humanitarian law sets certain requirements on parties to a conflict. And one of those is to ensure the well-being of the civilian population as much as possible, and proportionality and so on in the treatment of the civilian population. And really, I mean, what we're seeing on the ground, the clock is ticking to famine, and this is entirely man-made.
7 aid workers, as we all know, were killed in an Israeli missile strike. They worked for the NGO World Central Kitchen. The head of that organization, Hossein Andres, said that the convoy, there were 3 cars involved there, or 3 vehicles, were deliberately targeted. But I'm wondering, from an aid point of view, and your organization is primarily involved in supplying aid and relief to Palestinians, I mean, what kind of impact does this have on aid workers in Gaza?
Well, but the tragedy that affected World Central Kitchen, sadly, is more of the same that we've already been seeing for our own organisation since the beginning of the war, and indeed other entities. All told, we've had close to 200 humanitarians have been killed in the Gaza Strip. That's of whom 178 are employees of UNRWA. Now, this is the highest death toll in United Nations history for aid workers. That's a very stark statistic. Obviously, a lot of attention because of what happened with World Central Kitchen, notably because they were traveling in what we know as deconfliction. So in other words, we don't just sort of go gung-ho into our vehicles and sort of go to places where we need to deliver aid. We always do the maximum to ensure safety and security for people who are delivering aid. In this situation, this didn't happen, and we've also had our own sites and convoys have been hit. For example, earlier this year, one of our convoys was hit by naval gunfire, and one of our warehouses in Rafah in the southern Gaza Strip was hit by a strike, and we lost a member of staff there. So this is a pattern which has continued, as indeed the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres flagged a couple of days ago. This is a sign of what it's like to be a humanitarian in the Gaza Strip.
One other thing, UNRWA is, of course, the main relief organization for Palestinians, not just in the occupied territories, but also in other parts of the Middle East as well. Some time ago, a few months ago, Israel accused 16 UNRWA members of taking part in the October 7th attacks, which was initially what led to certain countries defunding the agency. Has UNRWA ever been presented with incontrovertible, independently verifiable evidence that its members were involved in those attacks on October 7th?
Absolutely not. We have received nothing. I should stress there is an independent investigation going on by the UN Office of Internal Oversight Services, which is the highest investigative body in the UN system. And that is entirely independent of UNRWA. But we, as an agency, have never received any kind of evidence, any kind of substantiation. We've seen these allegations. We've seen other kinds of allegations as well related to staff, not only since the war in Gaza, but in the past. I should stress that we take all allegations seriously, and we have vociferously condemned the attacks of the 7th of October. There be no doubt about that. But we have not had any evidence, and what has happened is the alleged actions of approximately, sort of 16 or something like that, members of our staff. I mean, let's put this into perspective. We have 30,000 staff across the region, 13,000 in Gaza. So we're talking about a tiny, tiny percentage of our staff. That's not to minimize the nature of allegations, but just that we're talking about punishing an entire organization that deals with a population of millions of people around the region, just on the alleged actions of a very, very small number of staff.
Jonathan Fowler, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Mohammad Marandi is a professor at the University of Tehran. Also with us is Abdel Bari Atwan. He's the Editor-in-Chief of Rai al-Youm, a London-based Arabic news site. And Yossi Mekelberg is an associate fellow with the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Yossi Mekelberg, 6 months into this conflict, let's look at the situation in Israel right now. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is under tremendous pressure to come to a deal with Hamas on the release of hostages. In fact, tens of thousands of protesters have taken to the streets. President Biden has also issued this warning to Israel. It's unprecedented and says that the Prime Minister has to allow humanitarian aid to get into Gaza and that there will be consequences if that is not addressed. How do you see the situation?
Well, you're absolutely right. There are cross pressures on Netanyahu in most of its own making. There is pressure in Israel because the protesters realize that the release of the hostages not the Prime Minister's top priority, despite promises, promising that this is a priority. It doesn't seem like this, while they are languishing in captivity in probably hellish conditions, and we don't know how many of them are still alive. On the other hand, the way that Israel conducted the war in Gaza created a humanitarian catastrophe there. It's not to exonerate Hamas of anything, but democracy can't fight a war like this. And as a result, Israel lost a lot of its friends, and even the United States is somehow, and President Biden is fed up. But we have also to to remember that he is facing also counter pressures from the right-wing members of the coalition that tells him that if Israel won't enter into Rafah, there is no point for him to be a prime minister, a thing that he wants to stay as long as possible.
Abdel Bari Atwan, the negotiations for the release of hostages, those negotiations continue in Egypt, in Cairo. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he is blaming Hamas for a lack of progress and is describing any deal at this stage would be a surrender to Hamas. Let's listen to what Netanyahu had to say.
Israel is not the one preventing a deal. Hamas prevents a deal. Its extreme demands were intended to bring about an end to the war and leave it intact, meaning to ensure its survival, its rehabilitation, its ability to endanger our citizens and our soldiers. Surrendering to Hamas's demands will allow it to try to repeat the crimes of October 7th again and again, as it promised to do. Hamas hopes that the pressure from outside and inside will make Israel surrender to these extreme demands. It will not happen. Israel is ready for a deal. Israel is not ready to surrender.
So, Abdel Bari Atwan, Israel has withdrawn some of its forces from Gaza. What, in your view, are the prospects for some kind of hostage deal and possibly a permanent ceasefire?
Well, I believe it is possible. Hamas was very cooperative with the negotiation in Cairo and in Doha before. But I'm surprised when Benjamin Netanyahu is blaming Hamas. Did Hamas kill 33,000 and about more than 100,000 were wounded among the Palestinians? Did Hamas destroy 86% of Gaza houses? So the people, more than 2 million people, completely homeless. So I think, when the Israeli propaganda is really concentrating on putting the blame of Hamas, the problem of the Palestinian, it did not start just 7th of October last year. No, it started 75 years ago. I am a refugee for 75 years, and my family the same. So we cannot blame the victims and say that they are complicating the situation. Hamas asked for 3 things, which is very legitimate. First, a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza.
Yeah.
Second, it's a full ceasefire. Third, reconstruction of Gaza. As I said, 2 million homeless now. So I think this is legitimate for the Palestinian people to ask. But Netanyahu said today he wouldn't stop the war unless he destroyed Hamas completely.
Mohammad Marandi, Iran appears to have been drawn into the conflict as well. As we know, an Iranian diplomatic mission was struck in Damascus. Several people were killed, including a senior military commander. Iran blames Israel and has warned that, as Iran puts it, this will not go unanswered and that Israel's embassies are now not safe. I mean, how serious is this situation? Could it risk a wider conflict?
Yes, it is definitely very serious. And there will definitely be a response from Iran over the past 6 months during this ongoing genocide, where I think many more than 33,000 people have been killed. Many thousand are missing under the rubble, and many thousand have died of sickness or disease and without malnutrition. But during this period, the Israeli regime attacked Iranian soldiers and Iranian officers in Syria on a number of occasions, and Iran suffered a number of casualties. Yet Iran did not respond. And the reason was that Iran did not want to distract attention away from the genocide. The Iranians wanted the world to focus on Gaza so that they would put pressure on the regime to end this catastrophe. But the regime insisted on changing the narrative. And ultimately, when they attacked the embassy, they went too far. The Iranians will have no option but to strike back and punish the regime, simply because if they don't, then the regime will continue to violate all norms. The embassy is a red line. It's Iranian sovereignty. So it is going to get more complicated. And and I don't know when Iran will strike, but it will definitely strike the regime.
Yeah, Mohammad, there's been one more development, and this comes through the United States television network, CBS, which is reporting that the United States has intelligence that Iran will use a swarm of drones as well as cruise missiles against Israel. And this report cites unnamed United States officials for this information. It didn't offer any kind of timeline, but what do you make of that?
Well, it doesn't. You don't need to be a genius to recognize that that is definitely an option. But the U.S. Intelligence sources have been saying a number of things over the last few days. On the first day when the Iranians said that they will retaliate, they said that Iran will retaliate within the next 48 hours, and nothing happened. So I'm sure there will be a response. It's quite possible that the response will include drones and missiles, but I don't think that the U.S. intelligence sources are really saying all that much.
Yossi, Mekelberg, as I said, Prime Minister Netanyahu is under pressure, but now we are seeing pressure come from some very unlikely quarters. I mean, here in the United States, the television network MSNBC, which is not a network that is normally hostile towards Israel, but they are beginning to ask some very tough questions of Israeli spokespeople. Here is one of the network hosts. He's quite well known in the United States. His name is Joe Scarborough. Here he is questioning the Israeli economy minister, Nir Berkat, about support in Israel from the Israeli government for the funding of Hamas in the past. Let's listen.
So explain to me, because I really want to know, why was Benjamin Netanyahu and his government funding? They were allies with Qatar in the funding of Hamas. Why?
I think it's a mistake, and it was uncovered October 7th. October 7th demonstrated that if you think you could buy quiet, peace, by funding Hamas, it's a huge mistake.
So you see, what are the implications of this?
Well, you had the senior minister admit that this was a colossal mistake. It's a mistake that enabled Hamas to build its military power, build the tunnels, and basically committed the atrocity of October 7th. And I think the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu refuses or has refused so far to take responsibility of that makes things even worse. He should take responsibility. He should leave government, should leave politics, face his corruption trial, not as a prime minister. He is responsible at the same time for not protecting his own people on October 7th. And until he's doing that, you know, there will be protest in the street, and we'll hear more and more of this criticism. All this paradigm about siphoning money to Hamas in order to buy quiet collapsed altogether, and he did it in order to avert the possibility of a two-state solution, to weaken the Fatah, the PA, and the PLO, which is another huge mistake, because more than anything else, there is a need for a proper, genuine peace process that would lead to a two-state solution.
Abdel Bari Atwan, Israel claims that it has killed up to 13,000 Hamas fighters. I mean, it's very hard to say, you know, whether this is true, but to what extent do you think Hamas has been degraded? Because we've seen subsequent reporting which shows us that in some instances, some of the tactics that Israel has been using would call into question those numbers. For instance, there was a report in the Israeli media which said that Israel has created these so-called kill zones, imaginary lines, and if anybody steps across those lines, they are killed. We also heard from an Israeli website that AI, artificial intelligence, is being used in some instances to target people. In many instances, these have been civilians.
I believe, you know, and many Israelis believe that Benjamin Netanyahu is a great liar, you know, who always saying things and never happen. He said several times he managed to destroy Hamas completely. He managed to destroy the the tunnels under Gaza, and he said several times that Hamas leadership is under the Al-Shifa hospital, and he used all these, lies in order to justify the genocide and ethnic cleansing in Gaza. But now he is saying that, but I believe Hamas is still alive and kicking. He did not actually release the hostages. He did not actually destroy Hamas. Hamas still ruling Gaza and still actually very powerful. So Netanyahu said several times he will actually kill Sinwar and other leaders of Hamas. He never did or managed to actually fulfill his promises to the Israeli. He deceived everybody. I believe when he said we killed 12,000 of Hamas, I think this is unbelievable and unacceptable. Why he is pulling out from Khan Yunis simply because he could not accommodate himself with the Israeli losses, army losses because of Hamas activities, Hamas weapons. And today they launched missiles against the settlement and the Gaza border near the south of Israel. So it is clear that Netanyahu is always deceiving his public opinion there, hoping to see or to support him in this genocide war.
Mohammad Marandi, if we look at the broader impact of what's been happening over the past 6 months in Gaza, I mean, we've seen the devastation of Gaza, the ferocity of the Israeli response after those attacks on October 7th, and we see what happens now, and the fact that there's been so many civilians killed, we don't know the exact number, but it's upwards of 33,000 people, has swayed world opinion. And in many instances, it's swayed world opinion against Israel. And we see Israel has been taken to court on charges of genocide by South Africa. What do you think are the wider implications for politics in the region with all this having taken place over the past 6 months?
I think that the Israeli regime has suffered an extraordinarily big defeat, and it will never recover from this. The regime has been exposed as an ethno-supremacist regime that is willing to do anything to the inferior people. And overwhelming the population in Israel, according to polls, have supported this genocide. And it shows that when Western governments, Western regimes, pamper ethno-supremacism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing for decades, this is what we're going to get. But the only good thing to come out of all this is that the world has been witness to these atrocities. Young American Jews, young Christians, Muslims in the United States, you see all working together against the genocide. And this is something that the Israeli regime will never recover from.
Okay, we are going to have to leave it there. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.